At first, you probably believed the problem was communication. You thought maybe she struggled to express emotions. Maybe she had trust issues. Maybe life had simply made her guarded. So you became patient. You gave more understanding, more effort, more emotional energy. But what you slowly discovered was something far more psychologically disturbing. The affection was never truly absent. It was carefully rationed. That is what keeps a person trapped in emotional starvation, not complete rejection. Complete rejection would actually set you free. The human mind can eventually accept a closed door. What destroys people psychologically is the partially open door, the occasional warmth, the sudden affection, the unexpected compliment after days of coldness. Those brief emotional rewards create confusion because they interrupt pain just long enough to keep hope alive. Carl Jung often spoke about the unconscious forces that govern human behavior, and one of the deepest truths he understood was that people become attached not only through pleasure, but through unpredictability. When affection becomes inconsistent, the psyche becomes hyper-focused. You start studying tone changes, facial expressions, expressions, delayed messages, subtle shifts in mood. Your entire emotional world begins revolving around earning another small moment of approval. And slowly, without realizing it, you abandon yourself. You stop asking whether the relationship is healthy. You stop questioning why basic emotional needs feel impossible to obtain. Instead, you become consumed by the pursuit itself. The mind begins interpreting emotional scarcity as emotional value. If her affection is rare, it must be important. If it is difficult to receive, it must be meaningful. But this is the illusion starvation creates. Healthy love does not keep a person emotionally dehydrated while offering occasional drops of water to maintain dependency. That dynamic resembles psychological conditioning far more than intimacy. And many people remain inside these cycles for years because the occasional tenderness feels powerful enough to erase the memory of emotional neglect. But notice what happens to you in the process. Your emotional standards lower. Your anxiety increases. You celebrate minimal effort as though it were profound love. A simple text message changes your entire mood because deprivation has made you emotionally desperate. This is how emotional control quietly forms, not always through aggression, but through calculated inconsistency. The tragedy is that many people confuse emotional intensity with emotional depth. They are not the same thing. Anxiety is not love. Craving is not connection. Emotional hunger is not intimacy. And the moment you finally understand that, the illusion begins to lose its power. Because the rarest thing in this world is not attention. It is consistent emotional peace. One of the most destructive psychological shifts happens when a person begins to feel ashamed of their own emotional needs. And in relationships built on emotional starvation, this shame does not appear accidentally. It is slowly conditioned into you over time. At the beginning, you probably expressed yourself naturally. You wanted reassurance, honesty, affection, communication, the basic emotional experiences that make human connection feel safe and alive. But each time you tried to voice those needs, the response carried a hidden message. You were too emotional, too sensitive, too demanding, too intense. Eventually, you stopped bringing your feelings forward, not because the need disappeared, but because you were trained to associate vulnerability with humiliation. This is where psychological manipulation becomes deeply dangerous, because it disconnects a person from their own inner reality. Carl Jung believed that emotions ignored by consciousness do not vanish. They descend into the unconscious and begin shaping behavior from beneath the surface. In other words, what you refuse to acknowledge within yourself will eventually control you indirectly. So when someone repeatedly teaches you to suppress your emotional needs, you do not become stronger. You become fragmented. Externally, you may appear calm and understanding. Internally, resentment, anxiety, loneliness, and confusion begin accumulating in silence. You start over-analyzing your own feelings before expressing them. You rehearse conversations in your head. You minimize your pain before speaking because you are afraid of appearing difficult. Even your suffering becomes filtered through self-doubt. And this is the tragic irony. The more emotionally deprived you become, the more carefully you try to avoid upsetting the person causing the deprivation. You begin adapting yourself to survive the relationship. You monitor your words. You suppress disappointment. You convince yourself that asking for consistency is unreasonable. Over time, the relationship stops being a place of connection and becomes a place of emotional self-erasure. This is why emotionally manipulative dynamics are so psychologically exhausting. The conflict is no longer just between two people. The conflict is now inside you. One part of you knows something is deeply wrong, while another part keeps defending the situation in order to preserve attachment. And the longer this continues, the more disconnected you become from your instincts. Your intuition speaks, but your fear silences it. Your emotional needs remain alive, but your mind labels them as weakness. Yet the truth is the exact opposite. A healthy person does not punish you for emotional honesty. A healthy connection does not require you to abandon your humanity in order to maintain peace. The ability to express emotional needs clearly and openly is not immaturity. It is psychological health, because the strongest people are not those who feel nothing. They are the ones who stop apologizing for what they truly need. One of the most psychologically destabilizing experiences in a relationship is the sudden shift from intimacy to emotional distance without explanation. One moment she feels deeply connected to you, attentive, warm, emotionally present. You begin to relax. You start believing the relationship is finally becoming secure. Then suddenly, without warning, the energy changes. She becomes cold, distant, hard to reach. Conversations lose warmth. Affection disappears, and you are left trying to understand what happened. This pattern is not merely confusing. It reshapes the nervous system. Human beings are psychologically wired to seek stability and attachment. When closeness is repeatedly followed by withdrawal, the mind enters a state of hypervigilance. You become emotionally alert at all times, scanning for signs of disconnection. You analyze pauses in conversation, changes in tone, delayed responses, subtle expressions. Your inner world becomes consumed by uncertainty because the emotional ground beneath you never feels stable for long. Carl Jung understood that unresolved psychological tension has enormous power over human behavior. The mind instinctively seeks resolution, and when someone repeatedly gives intimacy and then removes it, they create an emotional loop that keeps you mentally attached. Not because you feel fulfilled, but because your psyche becomes trapped trying to restore what was lost. This is why emotionally inconsistent relationships often feel addictive. The moments of closeness feel intensely meaningful precisely because they are unstable. The relief of receiving affection after emotional distance creates a powerful psychological reward, and over time you stop pursuing genuine connection and begin pursuing emotional relief. You are no longer experiencing peace, you are experiencing temporary escape from anxiety. That distinction changes everything. A healthy relationship does not leave you constantly trying to recover emotional stability. It does not train you to fear silence, distance, or unpredictability. Yet in emotionally manipulative dynamics, instability itself becomes the mechanism of control. When affection feels uncertain, your focus narrows completely onto the relationship. Your emotional energy becomes trapped inside the cycle of losing and regaining closeness. And slowly, your identity starts shrinking around that cycle. You neglect your own all is, your own clarity, your own emotional center, because so much psychological energy is being spent trying to reconnect with someone who repeatedly disconnects from you. The relationship becomes emotionally exhausting not because love is difficult, but because uncertainty is consuming your mind. The most dangerous part is that many people mistake this emotional turbulence for passion. They believe intensity must mean depth, but chaos is not depth. Anxiety is not intimacy. Emotional instability may feel powerful, but power and health are not the same thing. Real connection does not repeatedly pull you into fear in order to make you appreciate temporary affection. Real love creates emotional safety, not emotional withdrawal disguised as mystery. And the moment you stop chasing people who confuse your nervous system, you begin finding people who calm it. At some point, without fully realizing it, the relationship stopped feeling mutual. You were no longer simply sharing love, attention, or emotional presence. You were performing for approval. Every interaction became psychologically loaded with one silent question. What do I need to do to keep her emotionally engaged? And that. The question changes a person from the inside. Because once love begins feeling conditional, the human mind naturally starts adapting itself to avoid rejection. You become more careful, more accommodating, more willing to ignore your own discomfort if it means preserving emotional connection. What begins as effort slowly transforms into self-abandonment. Carl Jung spoke about the persona, the mask people create in order to gain acceptance from the external world. In unhealthy relationships, this mask becomes stronger and stronger until the real self almost disappears beneath it. You stop speaking naturally. You stop reacting honestly. You start shaping your personality around what will earn emotional approval and avoid emotional punishment. Notice how exhausting that becomes. You begin monitoring your words before sending messages. You replay conversations afterward, wondering if you said the wrong thing. You become highly sensitive to shifts in her mood, because her approval now determines your emotional state. When she is warm, you feel relief. When she becomes distant, you feel anxiety. Your inner stability slowly gets handed over to another person's unpredictability. This is why emotionally manipulative relationships drain people so deeply. It is not only the lack of affection that hurts, it is the constant psychological labor of trying to secure affection that may disappear at any moment. And eventually, you stop asking yourself an important question. Why must love be earned this way at all? Healthy love does not require endless emotional auditions. It does not force one person to constantly prove their worth while the other controls validation like a scarce resource. In genuine connection, affection flows naturally because both people feel emotionally safe enough to be authentic. There is no constant fear of losing value overnight, but when approval becomes the emotional currency of the relationship, something dangerous happens. Your self-worth becomes externally controlled. You no longer evaluate yourself by your own principles, your own character, or your own emotional truth. You evaluate yourself based on her reactions. Her attention becomes proof that you matter. Her distance becomes proof that you failed. That is not love. That is psychological dependency disguised as romance. And the tragedy is that many people remain trapped in this sea, because they confuse effort with devotion. They believe suffering for love makes the connection meaningful, but suffering alone proves nothing. A person can drown while trying to save a relationship that was never emotionally balanced to begin with. Real love does not demand that you erase yourself to maintain connection. The right relationship will never require you to perform constantly for the basic right to feel valued. Most people assume control in a relationship looks obvious. They imagine shouting threats, domination, open manipulation. But some of the most powerful forms of control are quiet, psychological, invisible to outsiders. And emotional starvation is one of the clearest examples of this hidden dynamic. Because when a person keeps you emotionally deprived, they are not simply withholding affection. They are shaping your behavior. Human beings are deeply influenced by emotional security. When that security disappears, the mind becomes preoccupied with restoring it. Your thoughts narrow. Your emotional energy concentrates around the relationship. You become less focused on your own growth, your own clarity, your own independence, because internally you are trapped. Ying to solve the emotional instability being created around you. Carl Jung understood that what controls a person psychologically is often what remains unconscious. And many people never fully realize how much emotional deprivation alters their decisions. They think they are fighting for love, when in reality they are fighting for relief from emotional anxiety. That distinction matters, because once someone recognizes that your emotional state depends heavily on their validation, they gain enormous influence over you. Your fear of losing connection makes you easier to manipulate, easier to guilt trip, easier to silence. You tolerate behaviors you would normally reject because your emotional survival feels attached to keeping the relationship intact. And slowly, fear replaces authenticity. You stop speaking openly because you fear emotional withdrawal. You stop setting boundaries because you fear distance. You stop confronting disrespect because you fear abandonment. The relationship becomes psychologically unbalanced because one person is constantly adapting while the other controls emotional access. This is why emotional starvation is ultimately about power more than love. Love seeks connection. Control seeks dependency. A person who genuinely loves you does not intentionally keep you emotionally unstable in order to maintain influence. They do not create confusion, so you remain emotionally fixated on them. Yet many emotionally manipulative dynamics operate exactly this way. Moments of warmth followed by absence, validation followed by criticism, closeness followed by detachment. The inconsistency itself keeps you psychologically hooked because your mind becomes addicted to resolution. And over time, something deeply damaging happens to your identity. You begin losing trust in your own perceptions. Your emotional exhaustion becomes normalized. You start believing anxiety is part of love itself. But the human nervous system was never designed to live in constant emotional uncertainty. Prolonged instability slowly weakens confidence, clarity, and emotional independence. The frightening part is that many people do not recognize the cycle until they finally step away from it. Only then do they realize how much of their emotional life had been organized around avoiding another person's withdrawal. And that realization can be painful, but it is all so liberating. Because the moment you understand that emotional deprivation was being used to control your attachment, you stop begging for what should have been given freely in the first place. And when fear no longer controls your need for connection, manipulation begins to lose its power. The turning point in these relationships does not happen when the other person suddenly changes. In most cases, they do not. The real transformation begins the moment you stop romanticizing emotional starvation and finally see it for what it is: a cycle that survives only as long as your hope continues feeding it. That realization is painful because it forces you to confront something many people spend years avoiding. You are not starving because love was deep. You are starving because love was inconsistent. And the human mind has a dangerous tendency to confuse emotional struggle with emotional meaning. Carl Jung believed that psychological growth begins when a person becomes conscious of the patterns controlling their life. Until then, the same suffering repeats itself in different forms, different faces, different relationships. This is why so many people leave one emotionally manipulated type connection only to enter another. The external situation changes, but the internal wound remains unexamined. And one of the deepest wounds emotional starvation creates is the belief that love must be earned through endurance. You begin believing patience will eventually unlock consistency. You convince yourself that if you love hard enough, understand deeply enough, sacrifice enough, the other person will finally become emotionally available. But healthy love is not something you beg into existence. It is either present in the foundation of the relationship, or it is not. Healing begins when you stop chasing emotional breadcrumbs as though they are a feast. It begins when you stop celebrating temporary affection that merely interrupts long periods of neglect. It begins when you stop interpreting confusion as chemistry and anxiety as passion. Most importantly, it begins when you reconnect with your own emotional reality instead of constantly reshaping yourself around someone else's instability. Because the truth is, emotionally healthy people do not make you feel chronically uncertain about where you stand with them. Their presence brings clarity, not confusion, stability, not emotional chaos. You are not forced to decode mixed signals or survive endless emotional tests in order to feel valued. And this is where many people finally rediscover themselves. The energy once spent obsessing over another person's inconsistency begins returning inward. Your thoughts become clearer. Your nervous system becomes calmer. You stop waking up emotionally anxious, wondering whether today will bring warmth or distance. You begin remembering what peace feels like. That peace is not boring. It is not weak. It is the psychological environment where genuine connection can finally exist. Many people fear walking away from emotionally manipulative relationships because they mistake emotional intensity for irreplaceable love. But intensity fades, anxiety exhausts the soul, and eventually, every human being reaches a moment where they must decide whether attachment is worth the destruction of their inner stability. The answer determines the rest of their life, because the moment you stop begging for crumbs, you remember you were never meant to starve at all.